This evening, we are proud to present one of these whistleblowers, ex-CIA agent John Kiriakou. He was the first government official to confirm the use of waterboarding by the Bush administration. In response, the U.S. government prosecuted John under the Espionage Act. John spent 23 months in jail, lost his pension and life savings, is deeply in debt, but he came through with his family and his dignity intact.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I was telling Brad Thacker when he picked me up at the airport, I'm 51 years old, I've been to 43 states, I've never been to Colorado before. I'm not sure how that happened, but there it is. So I'm really happy to be here. There are so many things that I'd like to talk about tonight, but I'm going to try to keep it short because I hope we can have a conversation afterwards and some questions and answers and really get to some of the bottom of some of these issues. But I'd like to first talk about Abu Zubaydah. Many of you, perhaps most of you, know the story of Abu Zubaydah. Abu Zubaydah was supposed to have been the #3 ranking person in Al-Qaeda. And when I was stationed in Pakistan as the chief of counterterrorism operations for the CIA, liberals or patriots, right? The Republican Party and the conservative movement in this country do not have a monopoly on patriotism. So I was in Pakistan. We received orders to capture Abu Zubaydah. He was somewhere in Pakistan. We had to catch him. But Pakistan is the size of Texas, and it is populated by about 270 million people. So to say he's somewhere in Pakistan, go catch him, it's a non-starter. Anyway, we caught him. March 28th, I think it was, 2002. He had been shot while he was trying to escape. A Pakistani policeman shot him 3 times with an AK-47, and he nearly bled to death. About a day and a half later, when he finally came out of a coma, we began to talk. I sat by his bedside for 56 hours, and I thought, wow, this is kind of a unique opportunity, maybe an historic opportunity, so I'm going to make the most of it. And I tried to engage him in conversation. At first, he asked me to kill him. He asked me to smother him with a pillow. And once he calmed down, we talked about things like poetry. He said that he would never know the touch of a woman. He would never know the joy of fatherhood. He said that he didn't want to attack the United States on September 11th. He wanted to attack Israel, but he had been overruled. And I kind of yelled at him at that point, and I said, listen, there were 50,000 people in those towers that morning. What did you think we were going to do? Did you think we wouldn't come after you? Did you not think or assume that we would try to destroy your group? But with that said, I told him, I should hate you. And I don't. You're pathetic. I feel sorry for you. And I said, I'm going to give you some advice, and I hope you'll take it. I am the nicest guy that you'll meet in this experience. My colleagues are not as nice as I am, and you have to cooperate. And he said, you seem like a nice man, but you're the enemy, and I'll never cooperate. So, a day later, a CIA jet flew in to pick him up in the middle of the night. I wished him luck. He asked me to hold his hand as we loaded him onto the plane. And I had no idea where he was going. I recount a story in my book where we were waiting for the manifest to be accepted. And an American got off the plane completely dressed in black, with a black mask and a black hat and a black sweater and a bandolier. And he said, John? And I said, who are you? And he lifted up his mask, and he had been my last boss at headquarters. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, oh, I'm the chief of counterterrorism here. I said, what are you doing here? He said, oh, I volunteered for the flight. I'm going to take your prisoner onward. And he said, who is he? And I said, geez, I'm sorry, but you don't have a need to know who he is. We hadn't even told the Pakistanis who he was. We just called him a big fish, and they referred to him as Mr. Fish. So I said, where are you taking him? And he said, I'm sorry, but you don't have a need to know. And it wasn't until many months later that I started hearing these rumors about secret prisons that the CIA had. I still didn't know anything about any torture program until I returned from Pakistan in the early summer of 2002, and a senior officer in the CIA's Counterterrorism Center approached me and said, listen, I wanted to ask you if you'd be interested in being trained in enhanced interrogation techniques. I said, what does that mean, enhanced interrogation techniques? He said, very excitedly, we're going to start getting rough with these guys. And I said, well, what does that mean, rough? So he told me these 10 techniques that the CIA was going to begin using on prisoners. I said, that sounds like a torture program. I don't think I want to be involved in that. But I said, you know what? Give me an hour. So I went upstairs to the executive floor, the 7th floor of the CIA. I had a friendly relationship with a very, very senior CIA officer who had been my boss in the Middle East a decade earlier. And I said, hey, somebody just approached me and asked me if I wanted to do this enhanced interrogation techniques. What do you think of this? And he said, and he denies that this conversation ever took place, but he told me, first, let's call it what it is. It's a torture program. Second, torture is a slippery slope. And you know how these guys are. Somebody's going to go overboard and they're going to kill a prisoner. And when that happens, there's going to be a congressional investigation, and then there's going to be a Justice Department investigation, and somebody's going to go to prison. Do you want to go to prison? I said, no, I don't want to go to prison. Turned out I'm the only one that went to prison. But I said, no. I went back down to the Counterterrorism Center and I said, I am not interested in this. It's a torture program. Well, what the CIA ended up doing was really criminal in and of itself before they even laid a hand on Abu Zubaydah, because the FBI was already at this secret location. There was an FBI agent by the name of Ali Soufan. He was a naturalized American of Egyptian origin, and he was a terrific FBI agent. And believe me, it's like a kick in my gut to compliment the FBI, but this guy was actually really good at his job. And what Ali did, once Abu Zubaydah began to recover, was he sat across a table from him. He offered him a date, or an apple, or an orange, or whatever it was they had, and he engaged him in conversation. And over the course of the next couple of weeks, Abu Zubaydah began to offer Ali actionable intelligence that was used to disrupt future terrorist attacks, and which probably saved American lives. Not by beating him, not by freezing him, or putting cockroaches in a box and putting him in the box with the roaches, which we did, because he had a terrible fear of cockroaches, but just by engaging the man in conversation. For whatever reason, George Tenet, the director of the CIA, didn't like having the FBI in charge of this operation. And so he went to George W. Bush and he said, I want primacy in this operation and I want you to remove the FBI from the country. And George W. Bush said, okay. And so Ali Soufan was pulled out of the country and was replaced not only by CIA officers and CIA contractors, but by 2 contract psychologists who had been hired specifically to create a torture program. On August 1st, the president signed an executive order allowing the CIA to begin torturing Abu Zubaydah. This was after the procurement of specious legal arguments from the notorious Jay Bybee and John Yoo, both of whom have gone on to great success in their chosen field of law. And so Abu Zubaydah was tortured. Now, the program was such that these CIA officers were supposed to start with the most basic so-called techniques. Something like a smack in the belly, right? Makes a loud cracking sound, humiliates you, makes you angry, you know you can't respond. But then they went up the list very quickly. There was one technique called walling, for example. That's when you grab the prisoner by the shirt or the lapels and slam him into a plywood wall. Now, he's supposed to have either a rolled up towel around his neck or one of those sleep pillows so he doesn't hurt his neck. And it's supposed to be, the wall's supposed to be plywood. Well, they forgot to give him the pillow to protect his neck. And the wall was concrete. So, sorry about that. I mean, that's what the cable said, according to the Senate torture report. It escalated quickly from there. A lot has been made about waterboarding. Waterboarding is when a prisoner is tied or shackled to a board or a gurney. His feet are slightly elevated. Some sort of material, cloth, burlap, is put either around or in the mouth, and then water is poured on his face. It gives you the feeling of drowning, and it's a horrible thing to see. It's a worse thing to go through, but the prisoner will convulse, start to vomit. You tense your abdominal muscles, which causes extreme pain, and oftentimes you faint. I would posit that was not the worst thing that Abu Zubaydah endured. There were other techniques that, for whatever reason, have not gotten as much press. One was sleep deprivation. Now, Donald Rumsfeld, who is also a war criminal as far as I'm concerned, Donald Rumsfeld made a point of mocking the fact that people were complaining about sleep deprivation as a torture technique, saying, I've worked in my office 48, 72 hours at a time, and I have a stand-up desk. I don't even have a chair. But we're not talking about 48 or 72 hours. Imagine being chained to an eye bolt in the ceiling where you can't kneel or lay down, and you're kept like that for 14 days. Now, psychologists will tell us that people begin losing their minds around day 9, and they begin dying around day 12. If you read the Senate torture report, you'll see that the orders from the CIA were to not exceed 14 days. Well, if you're already dead at 12, what's the point of cutting it off at 14? Another technique was called the cold cell, where the prisoner is chained to that same eye bolt in the ceiling, and he's stripped naked. And the cell is chilled to 50 degrees, and then every hour somebody comes in and throws a bucket of ice water on him. 2 people were killed by CIA officers using that technique. But those officers were never prosecuted. At the very, very least, that has to be depraved indifference or manslaughter. If there was a cable saying, do this to him, that would make it first-degree murder, wouldn't it? I mean, at the federal level, and this would be a federal crime, that's a death penalty case. But no one was ever prosecuted. Abu Zubaydah also underwent something else that has gotten very little play in the press. When we captured him, I noticed that one of his eyes was a very, very pale blue. He was blind in the one eye, and it turned out that it was an old shrapnel wound from the Afghan war with the Soviets. Well, Jason Leopold, a reporter at Vice News, found through the Freedom of Information Act that Abu Zubaydah one day was sedated without ever being told what was happening to him, and when he woke up, his eyeball was gone. We had just taken it out. We didn't ask him if we could. We didn't ask him if he wanted us to. We just did it. That's a crime against humanity. Besides the fact that we have anti-torture laws in this country. We always have. There's a law called the Federal Torture Act. It specifically defines torture and specifically prohibits it. And to say it simply, it defines torture essentially as anything that makes somebody uncomfortable or causes them pain. And it doesn't have to be just carried out by someone on behalf of the government. It can be carried out by someone working on behalf of someone working on behalf of the government. With the bottom line being, don't do it. It's illegal. So we have that law in the books. Besides that, the United States is a signatory to the UN Convention Against Torture. Not only are we a signatory, and one of the first signatories, we wrote the doggone United Nations Convention Against Torture. And it contains the same definition of torture and the same prohibition of torture or on torture that the Federal Torture Act has. In 1968, in January, the Washington Post ran a picture on its front page of an American soldier waterboarding a North Vietnamese prisoner. On the morning that that photo appeared, then Secretary of State McNamara, Robert S. McNamara, ordered an investigation. The soldier in the picture was arrested, he was tried and convicted of torture and imprisoned. Well, the law didn't change. Still the same law. So why was torture illegal in 1968, but it wasn't illegal in 2002 or in 2015 when John McCain and Dianne Feinstein were forced to pass a bill into law that just reiterated our ban on torture? I would go so far as to say that CIA aside, there is still torture taking place, and it's taking place right here in the United States. The United Nations has called the U.S. prison system's use of solitary confinement as a form of torture. And I'm going to tell you a story, and this I know firsthand. I spent 2 years in prison, thanks to Eric Holder and Barack Obama. And I never thought that I would, when you're somebody like me, right? I'm a middle class white guy, professional, got a master's degree, finished my PhD coursework. Never in my worst nightmares did I ever think I would end up in prison with pedophiles and murderers and drug dealers and just the worst people in the world. But prisons don't necessarily have the worst people in the world in them. I mean, there are a lot of people in prison that I personally felt didn't belong there. So I want to tell you about one. He was my last cellmate. His name was James. James was a mentally ill homeless man from Pittsburgh. And he was living in a cardboard box under a bridge, the Liberty Street Bridge in Pittsburgh. And he violated the terms of his federal parole just so that he could spend the winter indoors. Because it was better to be in prison through the winter. I mean, Pittsburgh winters are ferocious, than it was to be in this cardboard box. I walked into the cell one day and I saw him sitting on the edge of the bed and I said, "Hi, are you the new guy?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm James." He stood up and shook my hand. And I said, "Hi, James, I'm John." And he said, "Well, nice to meet you, John, but I got to tell you something. I have severe mental illness, and if I don't take my medication, I'm really crazy, like dangerous crazy." And I said, "Wow, I appreciate you telling me." I said, "We have a really good cell here. We all get along. It's all good guys. I think you're going to fit in fine." And later I thought, never did I think I'd be friends with a mentally ill homeless man. But he was a really great guy, and he had a terrific sense of humor. So he went down to the medical unit on his first full day to ask for his medications. Remember, he's only in on a violation. He's only going to be there 4 months. And the medication for paranoid schizophrenia is very expensive. And so in their infinite wisdom, the Bureau of Prisons and the National Health Service, or what do they call themselves with the uniforms? Public Health Service, thank you. The Public Health Service officers down there, they gave him Tylenol instead of his mental schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia medication. They gave him Tylenol. So he came back up to the cell and he was very upset. I said, "James, you can't take this, lying down. If you're mentally ill, you have to be medicated. Don't just take Tylenol and then let them get away with it. Go back down there and raise hell. And if they won't give you your medication, then file on them. There's this administrative remedy process. And while it doesn't work most of the time, because we're prisoners and they're officers, remember, who are people going to believe? The crazy homeless guy or the uniformed officer, right? So I said, if they don't give you your meds, you got to file on them. At least it'll go to the warden. And maybe the warden would turn out to be a decent guy. He turned out to be an asshole, to tell you the truth. But I thought maybe at least you have a chance. So James went back down, and they told him that he got what they were going to give him, and he needed to leave. So he filed a complaint. And he went down again the next day, and they told him to get out. They weren't going to give him any medication. So he filed another complaint. And he would do this every day. He did this for like 10 days. He would just go down, be turned down and file a complaint. Well, they deemed this to be harassment against staff. And so I happened to be in the visitor's room one day. A friend of mine from high school came to visit me, and it's all windows on one wall, and I saw James being led away in handcuffs, which only meant that, I should say only, that they were taking him to solitary confinement. Well, if you're sent to solitary for harassing staff, you usually go down there for 3 or 4 days until everybody cools off, and then the officer will go down into solitary and you apologize and they let you out. 4 or 5 days came and went, a week, 2 weeks. Finally they replaced James. They put an even crazier pedophile in his bed. So I said, boy, James is still in solitary. I said to one of the cellmates, I don't think things are good for him down there. Because you can guarantee he's not being medicated in solitary if he wasn't being medicated in the room. And then one day, a Mexican prisoner with whom I was friendly got out of solitary and sent me a message that he needed to see me. So we arranged to get together outside the yard where nobody could hear us speaking. And he said, you have access to the press and you've got to tell the public what happened to James. I said, what happened to James? And he said, he went crazy down in there. He started singing 99 bottles of beer on the wall, which everybody thought was kind of funny in the beginning, but he sang it for 9 hours without stopping. People were screaming from the other cells. Finally, he stood up on his bed, he took off his slipper, and he hit the sprinkler in his cell, which then sent the sprinklers off in every one of the 65 cells. And he flooded the cells. So of course, just like you see on MSNBC at 11 o'clock at night, they send in the SWAT team with their helmets and their vests, and they tase him. And then they beat him to a bloody pulp. After they beat him, and I should add, this was his second beating in prison. He was beaten so badly in his previous prison that he had to be hospitalized. But then the investigation found that his injuries were self-inflicted, right? Because we all beat each other, or beat ourselves, I should say, up in the face like this, right? So Jesus told me that after they beat him, they stripped him naked and they threw him outside into a cage. Now you hear a lot about solitary confinement being 23 hours a day, right? You're locked up for 23 hours. And you are, but that 1 hour, it's not like they just let you go for an hour. Each solitary cell has a door, a small door in it, which leads into a cage, a 10 by 8 foot cage. And so you're allowed to just walk in circles in the cage for an hour. And then you come back in. That's your 1 hour exercise, what they call exercise. So they stripped him naked after beating him, and they threw him outside in the cage. Now, it's January in the mountains of central Pennsylvania. It was 10 degrees. Jesus told me that at first James was apologizing. I'm sorry, please let me back in. At hour 2, he began crying. And about hour 3, he fainted. And that's when they brought him in. Instead of giving him his medication, they transferred him to a higher security prison because they said he was dangerous. Well, of course he's dangerous because he's crazy. And he's crazy because you won't give him his medication. Now, this is not an unusual story. This happens in American prisons every single day. And there's no accountability. None whatsoever. So while we're focused on these secret prisons that the CIA had been operating all around the world, the same kind of thing was going on right here at home, under our very noses. People ask me a lot if I think torture still exists. That is, U.S. government-sponsored torture, if that exists. You know, with the passage of the McCain-Feinstein Amendment, torture's banned, right? I want very much to believe that torture no longer exists. But everything that the CIA has told us since 9/11 has been a lie. Everything. So why should we believe them now? Now they're going to start telling the truth? You know, I spent 15 years with them. A CIA psychiatrist once told me that the CIA, please don't judge me for this, the CIA seeks to hire people with sociopathic tendencies, not sociopaths, but people with sociopathic tendencies. Now, sociopaths don't have consciences. And people with no conscience, people who feel no guilt, can easily pass a polygraph exam. But those people are also hard to manage and hard to control. People with sociopathic tendencies are comfortable operating in moral or ethical gray areas. But how do you weed out the sociopaths? We know from psychological studies that have been published over the last half a century that it's the sociopaths that rise to the top of corporate structures, including the CIA. That's why all the lunatics are the ones in charge. Because they can pass the polygraph. They can pass the background investigation. And by God, they're going to convince you that they are patriots. There's no ethics training at the CIA. None. You either go in there with your own moral code or you wing it. Usually when I speak at colleges and universities, I ask a question. And I think actually I'm going to ask the same question, and I'm serious about it, so I'd like to see a show of hands. Let's say that you are a CIA case officer, and you've recruited a major penetration of a foreign terrorist group. Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, ISIS, whatever you want it to be. This guy's the real deal, and he's reporting to you every month, and he's giving you this actionable intelligence, and it's going straight to the president, and you're getting promoted, and everything is great, right? This is every officer's dream. So he shows up at a meeting. Let's say you're meeting somewhere in the Middle East, maybe in a hotel. You go to this meeting, and he says, listen, I've been giving you the kitchen sink, and everything I say is true. And I've saved American lives. So now you're going to do something for me. You're going to go out and you're going to get me a prostitute. And if you don't get me a prostitute, I'm not going to work with you anymore. Do you get him a prostitute? Who says yes? Yeah, sure. He's a scumbag. You know he's a scumbag. It's your job to deal with scumbags. So sure, you get him a prostitute. What if he asks for a child prostitute? Yeah, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Not in a million years. But there are no rules. And generally, you don't really have to ask anybody for permission. You just do it. So, if you've got no personal moral structure or ethical structure, something that you've been taught as a child, or something maybe that you've even had born into you, what do you have to lean on? Well, what's happened is many of the CIA's leaders, at least through the ill-named war on terror, didn't have that ethical background. They would be the kinds of guys who would get the child prostitute and not think twice about it. People also ask me a lot, how in the world could you have worked for the CIA? One of the most murderous and criminal organizations in the world. I was born into a Greek immigrant family. My grandparents were immigrants from Greece, from the island of Rhodes. And to hear my grandfather tell it, Franklin Roosevelt was waiting for him at Ellis Island to hand him his citizenship and a job at U.S. Steel. We had, until the day he died, we had a framed picture of Franklin Roosevelt on our television set. I still have it. I love it. And so my parents raised me to believe that we were so fortunate to be allowed into this country and to really be given the opportunity for success that we needed to repay it. And you repay it through public service. So I was recruited into the CIA, but before I accepted the position, I asked the boyfriend of a woman I was in graduate school with about his experience in the CIA. He had been in the CIA about 3 years. Well, this is the 1980s, so the church committee is still pretty fresh in everybody's mind. And I said to him, so what about, the assassinations and Mossadegh and Guatemala and the Dominican Republic? I mean, did that stuff just go away? Yeah, we don't do any of that stuff anymore. It's really great, you're gonna be happy there. And I said, yeah, but what about, MK Ultra and, no, we don't do that anymore. It's all on the up and up. I said, wow, okay, well, love to see the world. And I did, went to 65 countries with the CIA. So I joined. And I'll tell you the truth, things were actually pretty good through George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. I remember Bill Clinton ordering the Directorate of Operations to go through its files and to purge everybody from the source rolls who had any human rights problems in their backgrounds. Because we don't want to be in the business of associating with people who had poor human rights records. And I thought, wow, okay, well maybe things really are changing. And honestly, even in retrospect, I think they had been changing. And then September 11th happened. And September 11th just changed everything again, permanently. Jessalyn Radack says in the film Silenced that Brad Thacker mentioned, or no, it wasn't Brad, it was Dr. Gilbert. She said, I want my September 10th country back. Because these things tend to be a pendulum, they're cyclical, they go back and forth. Well, after September 11th, they went like that and never came back down again. We've got the so-called Patriot Act. We have NSA spying on Americans now. We have the CIA spying on Americans. They're building secret prisons and torturing people and armies of paramilitary fighters. And that's not the CIA I signed on for. And so I decided it was time to leave. Now, I'm probably the only person who, when he says he resigned to spend more time with his children, actually resigned to spend more time with his children. But I kept my mouth shut about everything for years. And then one day in 2007, Brian Ross of ABC News called me. And he said that he had a source who said that I had tortured Abu Zubaydah. I said that was absolutely untrue. I was the only person who was kind to Abu Zubaydah. I've never laid a hand on Abu Zubaydah or on any other person. I said, your source is either misinformed or he's a liar. Well, you're welcome to come on the show and defend yourself, he said. Old reporter's trick that I didn't know anything about. I said, I'd think about it. So that week, President Bush gave a press conference in which he looked right at the camera and said, we do not torture. We do not torture. And I said to my wife, who was also a CIA officer, that's a bald-faced lie. He's just looking right into the eyes of the American people and he's lying. And then a couple of days after that, in response to a reporter's question, he said, if there is torture, it's the result of a rogue CIA officer. And I thought, I wonder if they're going to try to pin this on me. To tell you the truth, when I walked away from the CIA, I really walked away. I didn't pay any attention to these issues anymore. I didn't follow the whole torture debate. But in the back of my mind, I sort of recalled hearing that Human Rights Watch had issued a report saying the CIA was torturing prisoners. Amnesty International, a year later, came out with the same conclusion. And I just, in my mind, thought it was out there. So I called Brian Ross and I said, I'll come on your show. The intent was to defend myself. And I also decided that whatever he asked me, I was going to tell the truth. And so, in response to his questions, I said 3 things that have utterly changed the course of my life. I said the CIA was torturing its prisoners. I said torture was official US government policy. It was not a rogue, it was policy. And I said the policy was approved by and signed by the president himself, thereby calling the president a bald-faced liar to his face. In fact, the president said the next day, it's the only time any president's ever said anything about me. He said, I don't know this man. I don't know this man's motivation. I don't know why this man threw me under the bus. I was very proud to throw George W. Bush under the So the next day, the very next day, the CIA filed something called a crimes report against me with the Justice Department, and they asked the FBI to begin investigating me. That investigation began in earnest and was also leaked by the FBI to CNN. I read it in CNN. I otherwise had no idea it was under investigation. The investigation lasted a year, from December 2007 to December 2008, after the 2008 elections. And the Bush Justice Department decided that I had not committed a crime, and they closed the investigation. A month later, Barack Obama is inaugurated, and Eric Holder becomes Attorney General. The CIA goes to Eric Holder and says, that case against Kiriakou, we want you to reopen that case. I had no idea that this had happened. In the meantime, I'm working for John Kerry as the senior investigator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Kerry's intelligence advisor, with no idea that I'm under FBI investigation. The investigation lasted for another 4 years, 3 years, another 3 years. And then finally in 2012, just after leaving then Senator Kerry's employ, I was charged with 3 counts of espionage. 1 count of violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act of 1981. I'm only the second American ever charged with that. And making a false statement. And my attorneys and I, still to this day, we're not clear exactly what the false statement was supposed to have been. In any event, it was dropped. But 3 counts of espionage. Now, the first count of espionage, the CIA said I had revealed top secret code word information that was declassified solely for the purpose of prosecuting me. So what that information was, and I'm going to tell you, was that after the September 11th attacks, the CIA had a program to kill or capture members of Al-Qaeda. Top secret. That's an espionage charge. This is a potential death penalty charge. The other 2 espionage charges were equally insane. A reporter from the New York Times called me to say he was writing an article on a CIA officer who had never been undercover, ever in his life. He's on Facebook, CIA, employer CIA, works at CIA, LinkedIn, CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, never undercover. He resigned and he went to work for a consultant. So this reporter said, can you introduce me to this guy? I said, I haven't talked to that guy in years. I don't even know where he is. He's probably in Virginia somewhere. And then I said, but you know what? I have an old business card. I think I still have it. I found it, I scanned it, I emailed it to him. Espionage. Got an espionage charge for that. But before they could charge me, I actually sent it to a second journalist, one with whom I was working at the time at ABC News. There's 3 espionage charges. Now, they were all dropped because I hadn't committed espionage. But after my arrest, in the course of discovery, we found a memo that the CIA had written to the Attorney General's office, and it said, charge him with espionage. And the Attorney General's office wrote back and said, but he hasn't committed espionage. And the CIA said, charge him and make him defend himself. Because that's the plan. This is what they do. They don't care if you've committed espionage or not. I mean, of the people, and I believe the number's up to 9 now under the Obama administration, which is triple all previous presidents combined. 9 people charged with espionage. None of whom have ever been accused of passing information to a foreign government. Never. This is all for contact with the press. So the point is severalfold. Number 1, you scare the hell out of everybody else who's considering talking to the press. It's an indirect, it's an indirect threat against journalists. When the Attorney General himself identifies a journalist as an unindicted co-conspirator because he's written an article that the Attorney General doesn't like, that causes a chilling effect on freedom of the press and freedom of speech, basic constitutional rights. Third, they do something called stacking. they'll charge you not with one crime, they'll charge you with 10 or 20 crimes. And they'll make you defend yourself against those 10 or 20, or in my case 5 crimes, until you're bankrupt. And then they come back and say, all right, we'll drop all the charges but one if you take a plea. Well, what are you going to do? As Brad said, I still owe my attorneys $880,000, and that's after giving them $150,000, which was everything I had. You know, we had to move out of our house. My poor wife, was fired from the CIA the day of my arrest just because she was married to me. We had to go on welfare. And when we went to the welfare office, they said, my God, you qualify for everything. They gave us food stamps, cash payment, free milk and cheese, Medicaid. I mean, we qualified for everything they had. But that's the goal. The goal is to bankrupt you so that you'll take a plea to anything to make this go away. My attorneys told me, look, you've already spent $1 million. If we go to trial, it's going to be at least another $1 million, maybe another $2 million. And if we go to trial, you risk 45 years. Well, I'm 51 years old. That's a death penalty. I'll die in prison. There's no federal parole. You have to do the whole stretch, right? Ronald Reagan wanted to get tough on crime. There's no parole. So they're offering 2.5 years. It ceases being, I'm innocent, I didn't do it. And it becomes an economic decision. We figured, she finally got a job about 10 months after she was fired, my wife. I'm unemployable for the most part. But we figured, through the generosity of my brother, her father, our friends, anonymous supporters, we could make it 2 years. Anything more than 2 years and we're ruined for life. There won't be any comeback from that. So we took it. And I went to prison for what turned out to be 23 months. But my story is not as sad as Jeffrey Sterling's story. You know, Jeffrey literally did nothing wrong. And there was no evidence against him. But this is another thing they do, and they didn't do it just to Jeffrey, but they did this to Ed Snowden too. The government does something called venue shopping. And I'll give you these 2 examples. Jeffrey Sterling, a CIA officer, who blew the whistle to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence on an ill-fated and ill-thought-out operation against Iran. Jeffrey was living in St. Louis and working remotely for a company in New York. Okay, so St. Louis is the Eastern District of Missouri, New York is the Southern District of New York. He's alleged to have passed information to Jim Risen. I don't think he did. But Jim Risen lived in Bethesda, Maryland, which is the Southern District of Maryland, and worked in Washington, D.C., which is the Federal District of the District of Columbia. But they charged Jeffrey Sterling with a crime, actually with 7 counts of espionage and 2 counts of theft of government property, which was the information, right? He walked out of the building with the information in his head, so that's theft. Theft of government property is a felony. But they charged him in the Eastern District of Virginia. So why? Because the Eastern District of Virginia is known as the espionage court, and nobody ever wins there. Ever. There's one judge in particular, Judge Leonie Brinkema, ironically a Clinton appointee, who reserves every national security case for herself, and no one has ever won. Well, Jeffrey said from the beginning, I didn't do anything wrong. All the feds had on Jeffrey was that he had made 52 phone calls over the course of 5 years to Jim Risen at the New York Times. Well, Jim Risen was covering Jeffrey's civil suit against the CIA. The CIA passed him over for promotion solely because he was black. In fact, his boss had told him, we can't send you overseas because you'll stick out. And Jeffrey said, when did you realize I was black? So he resigned. He was passed over for promotion because he wasn't overseas. But he couldn't go overseas because he couldn't fit in. So he resigned, and he filed a civil suit against the agency. The agency argued that it could not defend itself because to do so would cause them to reveal national security secrets. And so Judge Leonie Brinkema dismissed the case with prejudice on national security grounds. So all the government had was that Jeffrey had spoken 52 times over the course of 5 years to Jim Risen. In the meantime, in 2006, Jim Risen writes a book called Bush at War, in which he talks about this botched operation. The CIA was incensed that this information had leaked out. And they said, who could have done it? That Jeffrey Sterling guy did it. He's angry with us because we passed him over for promotion and we got his suit thrown out. It had to be him. Charge him with espionage. And they did. 7 counts of espionage. And then these 2 counts of theft. Now, there was no proof. There were no emails. There were no telephone recordings. There were no clandestine meetings. Nothing. The government offered no evidence whatsoever. They could have been talking about the weather. I mean, 10 times over 5 years. 50 times over 5 years, 10 times a year. That's less than once a month. But they convicted him. Because in the Eastern District of Virginia, as the old saying goes, a jury there would convict a bologna sandwich.
You cannot appeal?
You can appeal, yes, Jeffrey can appeal, and he is appealing right now. You can only appeal, that's a great question. You can only appeal if you have gone to trial and lost at trial. I took a plea, and whenever you take a plea, it comes with a proviso that you cannot appeal, and you cannot file a Freedom of Information Act request on yourself to see if there was any FBI wrongdoing in the course of the investigation. So, Jeffrey's going to appeal. His wife, Holly, on Tuesday is presenting a petition to the White House with 110,000 signatures asking the president to pardon him. This president's not going to pardon him, just like this president's not going to pardon me. So, it's up to all of us to express our support. I can't because I'm a felon, and if I write to Jeffrey, I'll go back to prison because that would be consorting with known felons, but you can certainly express your support. I've used up my time. Thank you very much for being here. This is a really important group and a really important cause. We have to stick together and do the best we can. It's an uphill battle because we have fascists running our country, and I mean fascists of both parties. So let's keep fighting. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Question time. But we have a microphone here somewhere.
I think this is it. Is that it? Or is that it? No, that's ours.
I can speak up.
All right, yeah, please speak up.
There's a mic in the podium.
Can the president abolish the CIA?
Can the president abolish the CIA? I met with Oliver Stone day before yesterday for 2.5 hours. And he said that President Kennedy said he wanted to abolish the CIA and then ended up with 2 bullets in his head. So technically, sure, the president can abolish the CIA, but I don't see it happening in the in the near future. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan tried to raise this in Congress in 1976 and 1977. He was a senator from New York. And he argued quite persuasively, even in those times, that the CIA's clandestine intelligence collection could very easily be done by the Pentagon's Defense Human Services Command. And that the CIA's analytic arm, the Directorate of Intelligence, could very easily be folded into the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Science and technology can be split between the Pentagon and NASA, and then administration you wouldn't need anymore because there wouldn't be a CIA. And he wrote a book about this that was quite well received. So I think the answer is sure, we could abolish the CIA. I don't think we will, but we could.
John, we have another one here.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Brenda, and I'm really happy that you're here and talking about this,
Thank you.
and I won't get through this without crying, but my son was a combat medic in the Army, and his job when he got to Iraq in September of 2003 was to keep prisoners alive so they could be tortured more. And he was writing letters home, so I knew this was going on, and I spoke about it every chance I could get, and everybody told me I was absolutely crazy, I was out of my mind, we don't do that. The president said we don't do that. Peace group said, we're not really sure, we can't really talk about it. I said, I know, because I have the letters, and he can't make this stuff up. So he's 100% disabled now. And from not just the post-traumatic stress of being in Ramadi and having that job, but from the moral injury. And most people don't have any idea what moral injury is. Moral injury cannot be healed. Moral injury, there's no skills to learn to get through it, like there is with post-traumatic stress, and I won't call it a disorder because it's not a disorder. So, he's one of the guys who could be one of the 22 a day who commit suicide. So, right now, he's doing where they cut up military uniforms and make them into paper, and it's called Combat Paper Project. He also did a short documentary with him in it. His name is Eli Wright. The documentary is called Behind the Mask. It's on YouTube. I encourage you all to look it up to really get a little vision. And when you look at it and you see the mask that's him and the mask that's his friend who also participated in that and took his own life, and you see the mask of the innocent Iraqi man, I know that guy's name because he wrote home and told me. We can't, there's no yellow ribbons, there's no songs, there's no flags large enough to cover what we've done and continue to do in the world, and I can't tell you how appreciative I am. It's hard for me to be here.
I'm so sorry.
Because this is a wound that will never heal in our family. It's also a wound that will never heal in the families of the people that we touch over there, wherever over there is. So I really appreciate
Thank you.
your sacrifices.
I know that it's no consolation to you, but we know from the Senate torture report that what your son said was true. It was all true.
Thanks to John Kiriakou. Thank you very much. Thanks to KGNU, thanks to People Chair, Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice, and thank you very much, everyone. Please buy a book.